Everyday Samurai, Episode 49. Greetings, friends, and welcome to Everyday Samurai, in service to your liberty and the security of a free state. How do you do? Thank you for joining us once again for another exploration of how to secure liberty by way of the martial arts, a victorious mindset, and the science of political economy. Today we're talking with Jason Morgan. He's an associate professor at Reitaku University in Kashiwa, Japan, and was a Mises Fellow in 2016. But today, specifically, I'd like to talk about his most recent article for Mises.org, Private Security Isn't Enough: Why America Needs Militias. He does an excellent job of bringing together a number of different historical episodes that describe why security tends to gravitate towards the center, by which I mean the center of authority, but more specifically the center of money and a steady paycheck, which is another dysfunction of the modern nation state. And this is one of those perversions that the great economist Friedrich Bastiat talked about in The Law. The law gets perverted because there is a center and also happens to control a great deal of financial wherewithal because of its taxing authority. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case that declared the power to tax is the power to destroy. And in this particular case, the power to tax and then redistribute security assets is the very destruction of security for the average person. Instead of providing security for customers, actually becomes a source of perverting law, undermining security, and expropriating property rather than protecting it. All of this is contrary to the ideals of the American Constitution, where martial skill was supposed to be diffused throughout the entire population, and to execute law required well-regulated militia, meaning the whole body of the population, except for public officials, held those arms, were organized as such, and were disciplined to execute the law, repel invasions, and suppress insurrections without reliance upon a politico-bureaucratic caste. Now, as is painfully obvious, the world that we live in today has been turned upside down from that constitutional ideal. So I'm sure you're going to get a lot out of this conversation, because we discuss why your training in a martial art not only is necessary for your own good, but also to make a positive contribution to the security of a free state. And ultimately, rather than the so-called democratic peace theory, which doesn't hold up to the most cursory of scrutiny, to have an international system composed of states that are reliant upon their armed populations, rather than having the conquest and empire afforded through a fiat-based monetary system and permanent military establishments that derive their sustenance based on property aggression rather than protection. Security services like the militia that are based upon the property integrity principle would mean a great deal for a more peaceful geopolitical situation as well. Professor Morgan and I get into all these topics and more. Before we do, I wanted to bring your attention to the new resource library that's available at everydaysamurai.life/library. As you might know, there's an epidemic of veteran suicides. Approximately 22 veterans per day are taking their own lives in some way and probably living very desperate lives up until that extreme decision to end it all. I just had one of my colleagues that I first knew through the National Guard and then later in local law enforcement take his own life after a long struggle with alcoholism and a number of tragic incidents, including the inability to hold down a steady job. And it came as a shock to me, to be sure. However, it's entirely all too familiar. So I thought, what could I do? What could I offer? And all the things that I've learned, samurai-related martial arts contain an element of studying the mind. It's sometimes known as Shingaku no Michi, the way of studying the mind as a science. And we've talked about this in previous episodes, the importance of wringing stress out of the body. So we adopt a yoga practice, or to look at energy systems. And for that we look to Qigong, or in Japanese they call it Kiko, because any tension in the body is white noise in the mind. A healthy body is essential for studying the mind because we need that clarity to greater perceive solutions to the problems we are facing, and to think more clearly about our conditions so as to better perceive greater possibilities and pathways of being, staying solutions focused. This is also very much part of the way of the warrior. And it applies today just as much as it did back during the samurai period. In fact, the modern warrior needs these tools even more because the world is that much more complex. We need to have clarity of vision to see a way ahead, despite all of the noise and constant bombardment of media, along with the other stressors of modern life. There's no rear areas, there's no battle season. Fifth generational warfare, like what we're experiencing today, is largely an intelligence-based war. And as we know from Sun Tzu, all war is based on deception. Therefore, standing guard at the doorway of the mind is the most important element that any individual warrior can fortify him or herself with. So I put together some free resources for you at everydaysamurai.life/library, mostly focused on meditation, energy work, and a couple of things about wealth building and survival prepping. So get them into your hands, use them as much as possible, get them into the hands of someone you think that would benefit or resonate with the message. It's all there for you. It only costs you your email address, and I never spam anyone, so please check out everydaysamurai.life/library. Okay, let's get to our conversation with Professor Jason Morgan. Professor Jason Morgan, welcome to Everyday Samurai.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Really glad to dive into this recent article that you wrote regarding why private security isn't enough and why America needs militias. And I especially like the way that you tied in samurai history, and we'll dive into that deeply here shortly. But first, I'd like to know a little bit about you and how you found yourself to be teaching at Reitaku University in Chiba Prefecture, Japan.
Sure. I had an interest in Japan for most of my life. I had some neighbors who were from Japan, and my grandfather had been here after the Second World War and then during the Korean War. So he had told me a lot about his experiences, and I guess those two things were probably the first brushes that I had with Japan. And as an undergrad, I was studying some other things, and I started taking history classes, and I guess I remembered my earlier love for Japan and started taking Japanese history and Japanese language. And before long, I was in a Japanese language class and had met some folks from Japan and became friends with one of the guys. We were playing soccer together. And at the end of the year, when he was going back, I ended up going back for a month to spend summer with him and his family in Japan, and just sort of fell in love with the place and have been studying Japan ever since. How I ended up at Reitaku? Well, I finished up at the University of Wisconsin and was looking for a job and just happened to know somebody who knew that there was a job here. So that's how I ended up here.
And how long have you been teaching at Reitaku University?
I've been here this is my 5th year. I got here in this spring of 2017. So it's going on, I'm starting my 5th year now.
Outstanding. And what is your educational background that leads you to be a teacher?
Well, I've been all over the map, really. I started out in undergrad. I was a Greek and Latin major. Before that, I was an art major for a little while. It took me about 2 days to figure out I couldn't draw. So I quit that pretty quick. I've always been interested in arts and literature. As an undergrad, I ended up majoring in history. And as I said, I was really interested in Japan. And I came to study in Japan for a year at the end of my undergrad career, after I had visited my friend that summer. After that, I became interested in Chinese history and literature. And so I was at some universities in China studying for a while, and ended up at the University of Hawaii, where I did a graduate program. And then I spent some time in Korea. I was an English teacher in Korea. Came back to Japan, worked as a translator for a few years, ended up going back to the United States to do graduate work in Wisconsin. And then after that, I ended up here. So I've had a Haran Banjo life. I've been sort of up and down all over the map, as it were.
That's a breadth of experience, and a lot of time in Asia, not only in Japan, but like, as you said, China and Korea. So you've got quite the breadth of experience.
Well, I've been around. I don't know if I've learned anything, but I've certainly I've certainly been there, done that.
Since this article was published on Mises.org,
Mhm.
tell us a little bit about how you got involved in libertarian political theory.
Well, that's a great question. I don't even know that I would call myself a libertarian. I like to say I caucus with the libertarians. I was at the Mises Institute for a summer back in 2016. I just graduated from Wisconsin, and I was so happy to be at the Mises Institute because I don't know if you're familiar much with the University of Wisconsin, but it's pretty much like any other university in the United States. It's basically run by a cabal of anti-liberty, anti-American fascists. I don't know how else to put it. There are things you can't say. They're pretty much, they actually have a list of things you can't say. I don't like that.
A published list?
Yeah, there are a list of words that, well, they're words that you're not supposed to say. Let's see, you're not supposed, well, they're microaggressions, you know. So you're not supposed to say things like, we're all Americans or we're all the human race or something.
That's the parlance of our times.
And I just think that's just as a human being, that just everything in me recoils against being told that I can't say something or I can't think something. And I'd gotten, I guess, into Mises, you know, being in the United States, being in academic setting for so long, I've argued my way through hundreds of seminars, and I just got fed up with the censorship regime, and I started to look out to try to find people who were writing things that they weren't supposed to write, you know? And I don't mean bad things. I mean people who were bucking the orthodoxy and thinking for themselves. And I was just going through a list of books, and one thing led to another, and I think I ended up at Hans Hermann Hoppe. I think that was probably one of the first books I read that really introduced me to the Mises Institute and Rothbardianism and Lew Rockwell. So I think that was the initial stepping stone.
Which book from Hoppe was it, do you recall?
Democracy, the God That Failed. I thought that was just fantastic.
Outstanding.
Yeah, I mean, everything that he had said.
My first experience with Hans Hermann Hoppe was one of the podcasts, and I initially recoiled from his directness. Yet, when I read The Private Production of Defense and his introduction to the production of security, then I read Democracy, the God That Failed. That pretty much sealed the deal, and I've been going to his Property and Freedom Society conferences almost every year since 2013. So,
oh, is that right?
It's an excellent experience.
Very nice. I never met him personally. I've just read his books. You know, the thing you mentioned, The Private Production of Defense, I actually have a paper copy of that. I got it at the Mises Institute, and I was looking through it just before our talk here. And like you said, he's very direct. And when I first read him, I thought, no, I don't know. But then you go back, and it's hard to argue with the man. I mean, he's thought things through. So many people that from the Mises Institute associated with them. It was maybe the first time in my life, for the first time in a long time, where I had been in a group of people that were interested in ideas, and they didn't run away when you said something. I mean, I heard not everybody at the Mises Institute is a libertarian. I mean, there were folks there from all across the political spectrum. But what I thought was so wonderful was that we sat around for a summer and we just talked about big ideas and big books. And we were human beings, you know, we weren't accusing each other of being fascists or racists or whatever, the bigots or whatever. We were just having a good discussion. And I don't know many other places in the United States now where you can do that besides the Mises Institute.
Well, that leads us then to the deep thinking that you did just recently with this article on why private security isn't enough and the fact that America needs militias. So what prompted you to write that particular piece?
I guess there are a couple of streams going into that one. I'm from the South, and as I was growing up, I've always been interested in the Civil War. You know, in the South, you grow up with sort of a double consciousness, and borrowing a term here from W.B. Du Bois. On the one hand, you know that, you know, you're part of the country, and on the other hand, you know that there are some bad things that happened in the past. And to rectify those two things is not easy. You have to you have to study a lot of history before you begin to see what really happened. I credit actually the Abbeville Institute with this. I love reading their blogs and their books. There's the Kennedy brothers have a great book called The Yankee Empire. And they've been laying it out for years now about how, yes, slavery is a very bad thing. It was a very horrible sin. But at the same time, the government that put an end to that and that sort of conquered the American continent after that was maybe worse than than what we had down south. The people who have been killed in a series of wars that probably we didn't really have any business fighting. So I guess being a Southerner was one impetus to realizing that if you want to defend your homeland, you probably ought to do it yourself. I don't mean defend slavery. I mean that when you start to get up to the level of the government, just as Hans Hermann Hoppe laid out, the government works for itself. It doesn't work for the country that it's parasitic upon. And I think a militia, especially after 2020, when I saw Antifa, and even worse, going into communities around the country, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, all around the country, peaceful communities getting Molotov cocktailed and statues being torn down, businesses being burned. I thought, the police are not coming to help, and the Washington establishment is basically egging them on. So if you want to protect yourself, get a long gun, and sometimes you got to take care of business on your own accord. I guess those are maybe the two main strains that prompted me to write the incendiary piece for Mises.
Well, you start the article by talking about the deployment of the National Guard to Washington, D.C., and the regime is protecting itself. It's deploying assets, using the people's resources, but deploying in such a way to benefit themselves. Meanwhile, you have Chaz and Chop and all these other local communities that are having to fend for themselves and getting no protection for their tax dollars.
I was shocked. I was shocked and saddened as an American to see the National Guard being deployed as a political stunt against other Americans. This actually goes back to the Mises connection. I was at the Mises Institute in the summer of 2016 when Comey announced that he was unilaterally exonerating Hillary Clinton. And I'd been having conversations before that with family and friends and saying, the FBI is going to do the right thing. The FBI, they're not political. I can laugh about it now. But 5 years ago, I thought, the FBI, they're still going to play it straight. You got a lot of malfeasance in Washington, but at least we can count on, the federal police enforcement to do the right thing. And then Comey just made a completely political move to exonerate Hillary Clinton. And then I read Lee Smith's books, The Coup Against the President and The Permanent Coup, or The Plot Against the President, I think, The Permanent Coup, about Devin Nunes and how he has been trying to get to the bottom of what the FBI did to Trump from 2016 onwards. That, I think, to be honest, I think that summer radicalized me against the federal government. I lost all faith in the federal government to do the right thing. That summer at Mises was really transformative for me in a very good way.
I lost my faith in the federal government by being a Border Patrol agent.
Oh, my goodness.
So I've seen it from the inside out, and plus being a military officer. Yeah. So I've seen that these federal bureaucracies are, number one, incompetent. Even if they did want to do a good job, they can't just because of the systemic failures. And then 9 times out of 10, most people are looking to their own interests first before doing any form of public service.
I wonder if we can talk about that for a little while.
Sure thing.
About the military, if it's okay. My father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather all served proudly in the United States Navy, and I have tremendous respect for people who were in the military. A buddy of mine, Michael Yon.
Oh, yeah. I know him.
He's now a journalist.
Mm-hmm.
He's been all around the world. He was in Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. He's been there and taking pictures. One of the bravest men in the world, and just doesn't know the meaning of the word fear. He's a friend of mine, and he was a Green Beret. I couldn't hack it for 5 seconds, but what he did, going into combat like that, got total respect for people in the military, veterans. What I've had to really struggle with is reconciling that with the fact that the military itself, the American military itself, the brass, they're basically time-serving bureaucrats who don't get to where they are because of bravery or competence, but basically because they know which butts to kiss. And I'm not saying they're all like that, but it was really hard for me to get over that hump. Somebody who grew up in a family that respects the military, I never heard a cross word against anybody in the Army or Navy, anybody in Marines. But you know what really got me to thinking about this, actually? Michael Yawn was a big one. Smedley Butler was another one. I started to read Smedley Butler that summer when I was preparing to go to Mises. Smedley Butler was a general in World War I, and he figured out that he wrote a book called War is a Racket, and he figured out that all the brave things that he and his men did, all the men that died, wasn't for what he thought it was. It was for a cabal in Washington, Wall Street. And I thought, man, this Smedley Butler, here's a man, nobody can question his patriotism or his courage. I mean, this is a man who walked into fire, and he came back and he wrote one of the most trenchant criticisms of the military establishment. This is long before Vietnam, or when people started to really lose faith in the military. He was also transformative for me, Smedley Butler, and other military guys like yourself, the Border Patrol, people who have seen from the inside that so many American lives are wasted on nonsense, on making money for defense contractors. I can't imagine from the inside what it looks like to see how all this stuff plays out.
For the longest time, I knew that things were screwed up. I mean, it's hurry up and wait and all these other things about the military or law enforcement. It's everybody knows that things are screwed up, but it's only when you get into the political theory and political economy as illustrated by the Austrian school that helps you understand why these things are structural, and it's not just about personalities. So public choice economics talks about one of the problems, the principal agent problem, and then also concentrated benefits but dispersed costs. And Smedley Butler illustrated that so perfectly when he describes his experience securing Standard Oil as they're prospecting in China along the Yangtze River for oil.
Right.
Here we have a resource, namely the U.S. military, that's funded by the taxpayer. So we have those dispersed costs. Everybody pays their taxes and we fund this military. But then the concentrated benefits go to politically connected firms like Standard Oil.
Right.
That's what Smedley Butler realized when he was, quote unquote, muscle for capitalism.
Right.
Now that's cronyism. We understand that now, but that's just one of those things where you're like, man, that's screwed up. Or everybody in the military has this story of looking at something and going, oh, that's your tax dollars at work. But it's only when you start to understand Austrian theory that you can really understand the structural nature of it. And it's not just a fluke. It's actually baked into the system.
Right. It's baked into the system. I agree with you completely. Reading Rothbard has really opened my eyes to this as well. What I see now, the American military has basically, I think what happened and this gets us back into the little thing that I wrote for Mises about private security. Everybody wants to be patriotic, but in a structural way, Washington turns that patriotism into basically a motivation for private security for its own interests. It's as though the entire military was the Praetorian Guard of what Smedley Butler would call the capital, or what I think we would call the deep state maybe, or the cronyism between Wall Street and Washington. Whatever you want to call it, the boys that go out to die on the battlefield, they put their hand over their heart and they shed a tear at the sight of the American flag, and I'm right there with them. In a really insidious way, Washington has corrupted that and turned the military basically into its own private security force. The Militia Act, the Dick Act of 1903. It's because Washington was going raiding in Mexico, the Spanish-American War, that they needed to clarify that the National Guard could be federalized and that the militia, which was supposed to protect us from the government, was flipped over at that case and at that point, and the militia became the property of the federal government. So that now the fruits of that you saw this year, and when the National Guard was deployed to Washington. What happened on January the 6th? Okay. The only person that I know that got killed in that was Ashley Babbitt, who was killed by, I don't know, the rumor I heard was that she was killed by Pence's Secret Service agent. I don't know if that's true, but she was killed by somebody, by one of the Capitol officers or Secret Service agent.
Yeah, I've seen the footage. It's actually
Okay.
Yeah, it appears to be a Capitol police officer. There's footage available where you can see it, where she's trying to climb over a barrier to get into one of the inner chambers, and this Capitol police officer that's in uniform and he's in tactical gear. He actually takes her out point blank range with a rifle.
I don't imagine she was armed though, was she?
No. And
you've got a woman coming over a barrier.
Well, we can get into all sorts of different perspectives on it, but it looks as though she was egged on. Like, here's the door to go through, here, walk through it, and somebody else kind of pointed the way to her, but she was the one that took the lead and wound up getting shot for it. But anyway, I'd like to go back to this structural question, because the 1903 Dick Act that you mentioned is something that really was a watershed event in changing the structure. And as you said, it's kind of the world has been turned upside down, because the militia was supposed to be protecting the people and maintaining that constitutional order, but by this act of Congress created this National Guard, or stated that the militia of the quote-unquote United States is the National Guard, and then there'll be this other thing called the unorganized militia. Well, that's an oxymoron. That's prima facie invalid, because there's no such thing as a militia of the United States. There's the militia of the several states. And then the other thing is that by definition, a militia is organized, armed, and disciplined. It can't be unorganized. That goes against the very definition that's found in Article 1, Section 8. So the Dick Act is unconstitutional from its face, and yet it's kind of become the accepted practice.
Well, to get back to the structural question, I think the way that they got around this was, well, there are several ways. One is by funding. That they can say, well, it's still a state militia, but all the paychecks are coming, all the funding is coming from the federal government. I read something where when people protested and said that we can't have, some governors protested and said we can't have our National Guard, our state National Guard, being deployed overseas. And so the federal government just had everybody resign from the National Guard, and then in the next minute sign up for the army or whatever it was, the federal deployment overseas. And so it was clear that it was unconstitutional, and they had to do workarounds to make it work. But I think it's part of this federal takeover of the states, and then of just the private lives of individual citizens. There's a friend of mine, his name is Bill McClay. He wrote a really good history book called The Land of Hope, Invitation to the American Story. It came out a couple of years ago. His first book is one of the classics of American intellectual history. It's called The Masterless. And in that book, he makes great use of the grand review of the Union Army after the Civil War. After the Civil War, Appomattox Courthouse, everything is signed, the war is over. The Union Army, which had been basically non-existent in 1860, and then put together piece by piece over the course of the war, at the end of the war was this world-conquering force. And they rode in review, the grand review of the Union Army. They rode in review, I think, through the streets of Washington in triumph. And McClay sees this as a turning point in American history, and I think that he's right. It's the point where Americans began to see military service in a federal army as one of the markers of patriotism, whereas Jeffersonians would have recoiled in horror. What are you doing? You're signing up to enslave yourself, basically. But after the Civil War, the federal government, I think, really made use of this, the military, the regalia, and the horses and the swords and the uniforms and everything. And they began to lure people away from their communities and into this bigger national belonging of federal army. And that federal army basically never stopped. It just kept going. And here we are today in 2021, and that army has basically taken over half the world. And still American boys are going out to die, the hills of Afghanistan or the deserts of Iraq for reasons that I can no longer really understand, to be honest with you. And that structural way, I think the military has co-opted the country.
It certainly has something to do with the financial remuneration and the rewards available. I think that we've hit upon one of those fundamental truisms. It's the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules.
Right.
And as you indicated with the example of the National Guard having everyone resign and then turn around and be federalized, now that's actually become a lot more streamlined through legislation. But back during the Spanish-American War or one of the earlier conflicts, folks are looking for that financial reward. And right now, I know that there's a lot of folks that don't want to get out of the military. They much rather have their paycheck just show up every 2 weeks, no matter what they do. And that kind of then leads us to the next question, which is the way that you tied in samurai history into this illustration of why America needs militia. Because the first shogunate under Minamoto Yoritomo, established in 1185, started out with pretty good intentions, but Yoritomo promised a little bit more stability and hereditary, I should say, a title or hereditary titles that you could pass down to your lineage. That was one of the things that got him the support of most of the warriors that were up until that point freelance. So that was one of those consolidation measures. And we could see that parallel between American history and Japanese history.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, the consolidation. I hadn't thought of that, the financial consolidation. I think definitely people were tired of fighting chaotically, and they wanted to be part of a bigger unit that had a better chance of winning. When I was thinking about the samurai and the private security, I went back to 663. This is what, be 12?
No math in public.
To 500 years before the Minamoto no Yoritomo and the Genpei War. I'm thinking of when Yamato was consolidating its power inside of Japan. The Yamato state, they were allied with Baekje, Kudara, in the southern part of the Korean peninsula, and the forces of Shilla were allied with the Tang forces, the huge Tang armies coming out of the Chinese mainland. And Yamato sent troops to help Baekje, and they were routed in 663. And Yamato and a lot of Baekje partisans also fled back to what's today Japan. And they were preparing for the retaliation from Tang and Shilla. And so the first sort of draft or conscription that I know of in Japanese history was after that, when they were trying to get people to basically man the beaches, waiting for this invasion that never came. As time went along, the Heian, talking 300 years later, 400 years later, when the Heian government was falling apart, they had been sending magistrates and strongmen out to the countryside to collect taxes when the tax system was breaking down. And samurai were basically the people who organized in the countryside to prevent their crops from being stolen by these government thugs from the capital. So they were militias. They were people who were protecting their own land. I mean, it makes perfect, as a human being, you can understand this completely. If some person from the government shows up and says, give me all of your rice, and you very much want politely to decline, then you're probably going to need some weapons and some people to back up your refusal to comply. So that, at first, I think the samurai, in that sense, the samurai were a very good force in Japan. They were protecting the autonomy of the villages, protecting the people. Then things spiraled out of control because, as you said, this clan and that clan began to fight, and before you know it was just constant warfare until the Genpei War and Minamoto no Yoritomo and the Taira and the Battle of Dan no Ura, the naval battle. And so eventually you need the strongest of the strongmen to put a lid on all of this chaotic fighting. And I think that's what we get to with what you're mentioning, with the founding of the Kamakura Bakufu, is eventually, once you start this process, it doesn't stop until you get the strongest of the strongmen to it was basically a military dictatorship.
And the fact that, as you indicate in the article, that everyone's trying to control the center, meaning all throughout history, the samurai and all the daimyo and all those that would be shogun were all trying to rule on behalf of the emperor, allowing the court nobles to just have ceremonial functions and largely spiritual ceremonies. Meanwhile, the actual day-to-day administration of the country would be done by these warriors and to create a caste system for themselves.
Right.
Ironic then, isn't it, that these folks that were originally out in the countrysides, protecting their territories, and then trying to
Right.
solidify their positions with hereditary titles that they could pass down to their lineage. They then enshrine that. So I guess I'm speaking about two different points. Number one is trying to control the center, and then number two is creating a caste for themselves, a special privilege in law, exclusive for themselves at the expense of everyone else.
Right. I think you've hit on it there, that controlling the center. This is very instructive for us when we think about the United States. I mean, this will jump ahead to the end of our discussion perhaps, but what you can see in the case of the samurai, I think very much, is that the desire to control the center produced endless civil war in Japan. It really didn't stop until the formation of if you have a bakufu that forms, then you can control a shogunate that forms. You can control it to some extent, but even at the end of the Tokugawa shogunate, the Satsuma and Choshu and Aizu Wakamatsu, there's a lot of people rising up against the center. This need to control the center, I think, is what turns militias into statist menaces, I think, or statist nuisances is the way that it was in the article.
Hey, friends. Let's take a tactical pause from the broadcast to quickly talk about the outstanding performance-enhancing supplements from Neurohacker Collective. These go far beyond the average daily vitamin to give you a competitive edge in all areas of your life. I got interested in nootropic supplements because I'd heard about their ability to provide superior mental acuity, clarity, and long-term brain health. What I've found is that Neurohacker Collective has the best science-based nootropic formula available. I was so impressed with the company and team that I became an investor as well as a subscribing customer. Now I get a monthly bundle of their products that elevates cognitive function, personal energy, cellular regeneration, sleep quality, and optimizes the aging process. If you're interested in promoting your best life with improved memory, focus, vitality, and resilience with the latest scientific and natural biochemistry support, check out the Neurohacker Collective Discovery Bundle. You can get a 15% discount on your first order at everydaysamurai.life/neuro and use the code EDSamurai. Join me as a subscriber. That's everydaysamurai.life/neuro and use the code EDSamurai at checkout. We now return to our scheduled program in progress. It's interesting that the animosities between the clans only went on a low simmer during those periods of relative stability. I don't say peace because it wasn't real peace during the Tokugawa era. It was just stability, and it kept those raging animosities at a low boil or a simmer. And then as soon as the first cracks started to open, all of that came raging back. So the Aizu Wakamatsu and especially the Choshu and Satsuma wanted to have their revenge that they had been waiting 250 years for, basically.
Right. I think, being from the South, I think I don't know if I can say I understand, but when you grow up in a country and you know that the center is not your center, that the center was built on the ruins of your part of the world, you kind of look at things a little askance. And so when I came to Japan and started to study Japanese history, I thought, that actually makes perfect sense. 250 years have passed and you're still thinking about, the day is going to come. The day is going to come. We're going to get ours. I think you're right. The endless cycle of recrimination or trying to put things right, that it becomes endless warfare that really is not for the original sake of why you had the militia in the first place. If you think about it, it was to protect your crops, your family, your own people, to keep the government away. And then the militias became the government, and it was probably not the best for just average people.
And especially the average people that were at one time eligible for forming those ranks of militia, self-protection, and then entering into service. So we bring back the example of the young Hideyoshi, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who rose up from farmer class,
right,
back before there was in fact a class, but started as a sandal bearer for Oda Nobunaga and wound up becoming the Kanpaku, not a shogun in his own right, but as close to it as possible at the time.
Right.
And then he's the one that started with the locking in of the classes and not less than ironic to indicate that he was the one that started confiscating weapons with his great sword hunt.
Right. I mean, it makes perfect sense when you think about it. I mean, the man who rose from nothing and lived by his sword would, of course, be the first one to take away everybody else's once he got to the top. I think that makes perfect sense. You know, when I think of Hideyoshi, I think of in China, the Hongwu Emperor, Zhu Yuanzhang. He's the founder of the Ming a couple hundred years before Hideyoshi. And he was also a peasant. He was dirt poor. And he became the emperor of China, the Taizu, the first emperor of the Ming dynasty. And he had a very similar disposition. I mean, as a man who came from nothing and really had to strangle and murder his way to the top, he was paranoid and he went on killing sprees. He was deeply suspicious of anybody else coming up from underneath him. I would say that a man like that, or like Hideyoshi, I don't think Hideyoshi was paranoid. Maybe at the end he was a little bit paranoid. I think that he made a very wise decision from his perspective to start confiscating swords. And also, which you can see is very interesting, he did the cadastral survey. I think these go together to get back to the structural question. I've been researching lately chosa in Japanese history, these surveys, and there are a lot of them. And there are a lot of surveys in other countries' histories too. The thing that the government does is they basically perpetuate themselves on monopoly on information and on, I guess, what Weber would call monopoly on violence, but which you could just as easily call fear. That Hideyoshi wants to know who owns the land, and he wants to keep the records. And then he wants everyone to be disarmed. I mean, I think there were still some swords. Of course, the samurai had swords. I think peasants still had sort of everyday use knives and swords, but the ability to carry the long swords, the samurai swords, the double swords, he put the kibosh on that. It makes sense. The government today, they ask for your papers and they confiscate your weapons. I mean, it's basically the same thing.
And isn't that also true in the Second Amendment community, that they see these patterns in history? We could look at Japan and also the National Socialist movement in Germany. Registration always leads to confiscation.
Right. Exactly. That's a good way to put it.
So then in the article, you talk about the samurai going from saviors to a statist nuisance. Mm-hmm. And then you also talk about the Pinkertons in the United States. So maybe you could explain a little bit about how those are related.
Sure. This article actually goes back to my summer at Mises. Everybody wrote a paper, and I had taken a few ideas and sort of mashed them together. One of the pieces of the paper that became this little article for Mises was about the Pinkerton samurai rule. And as I began to speak with the other fellows, other people at Mises, to read in Rothbard's library, which is at Mises. I mean, you can go through his books and read and see what he's underlined and put check marks next to. As I began to think, research, speak to other people, I began to see that this pattern kept repeating over and over again. And the samurai, the Pinkertons, the Praetorian Guard, I mean, whenever you have private security, which I think is great, there's a danger that it's going to latch on to the central power and flip allegiance. And so you saw this with the samurais we've just been discussing. With the Pinkertons, I mean, the Pinkertons were, I guess they started out as strike breakers, or they were private security guards. But it was Lincoln's election. He was getting death threats up and down the block in 1860. He's never going to make it to Washington on his way. And so the Pinkertons provided security for him, private security, during his inauguration, his travel to Washington. And, from there, the Pinkertons had steadily became the private security arm of the United States. They were his bodyguard during the Civil War. So it's this danger that I wanted to point out, because over the past couple of years, as I've seen our country descend into Antifa, communist violence, I think, we've got to come up with a solution to how we can protect our fellow citizens from these anti-civilizational forces of left-wing violence. Antifa, they're all over the place. They're egged on by the media. We need a solution. And we need to make sure that the solution is not worse than the problem. So I'm all for militias. I'm all for people having guns, big guns, lots of guns. I think the problem will be that if the United States descends into a kind of post-Roman Empire dissolution of the original civilization, the temptation will be for the strongest guy with the most guns to become a new Minamoto Yoritomo. And I'd really like to prevent that. I've been studying anarchy, reading a lot of libertarian papers about anarchy. And I don't mean anarchy in the sense of everybody running around and shooting each other and burning down buildings. I mean, sort of Hayekian organic order that comes out of just natural human relationships where you want to protect people that you love, protect your family, protect your village, protect your home. I think that's not anarchy. That's the highest form of social order in my view. But as soon as the state gets involved, any kind of organized government, then it's just a matter of time before you're paying 45% taxes and your weapons are gone and they're coming put you in camps. I don't need to give examples of how many times that's happened. So this Pinkerton samurai rule was kind of a way to say, look, folks, let's have a militia, but don't talk to anybody from the government. That's basically the Pinkerton samurai rule.
And going back to the Roman Praetorian example, they not only started out as hired help providing security to politicians, but then they started turning into
Right.
the kingmakers. They got to decide who would be the puppet, the figurehead. And I think that we're in an era where the United States now has a figurehead that is a mere puppet for, you use the term and I will happily as well, or not so happily, but the deep state. The state gets deep just by the fact that the bureaucracy continues to grow. It's not that there's some grand conspiracy behind this quote unquote deep state movement. It's just that the deeper the bureaucracy gets, the longer these things continue to churn and to become self-serving entities and institutions, then you've got this center that can be controlled. And that's exactly what the Praetorians did. And so they put the person who's going to take care of their interests first in charge.
Yeah, I mean, it's comical, really.
That's the one thing we need to be mindful of.
Exactly. I mean, if you read Gibbon or in any history of the Roman Empire, there's a point where it just becomes low comedy. You got Emperor Nobody who's been on the throne for 50 minutes. And they decide, well, we don't want this guy anymore. They just, depose him, and then the next guy is put on. And the whole performance is not even hidden at a certain point. It just becomes the Praetorian Guard is the toughs who are choosing the next puppet, the next figurehead. And I think you're exactly right. The government now, and Smedley Butler pointed this out, the government, they don't really work for us. They work for a group of people who are in the government. And I think you hit it on the head. The deep state, I really want to make this point. I'm glad you brought it up. The deep state is not some sort of group of geniuses sitting around twisting their mustaches. They're the most incompetent, unremarkable people that you can imagine. And they're sitting at a desk, or probably not. They're probably not even at their desk, but they're sitting in some room and they don't have a clue and they don't have any marketable skills. But they're running the country. I don't mean that it's not some group of evil geniuses. I'm talking about the people that you encounter when you have any sort of contact with a government bureaucracy. That's the deep state, the thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of regulations or the United States Code. I remember a few years ago, there was a regulation from, I think, the National Park Service or something, that you should not have s'mores. You should have fruit instead of s'mores on July 4th. This was 4 or 5 years ago. These are the people, this is the deep state. They're not so deep.
But they've got plans. And so they need people with guns to enforce those plans and enforce their will upon the average citizen, unfortunately. But that leads us back to the importance of the right to keep and bear arms. And unfortunately, I see a lot of quote unquote Second Amendment advocates that are so focused on the right to keep and bear arms, but an individual by themselves isn't really much of a match for an organized force. And so when we talk about the constitutional militia, and I think that even if the Second Amendment or the militia were not fully enshrined in the Constitution, even in an anarchic system, a militia-like structure would have to emerge to prevent anyone from becoming a monopoly in the Weberian state sense. So we go back to the right to keep and bear arms, but it has to be not only armed, but organized and disciplined. So that then leads me to the next question, which is, how is militia a culture more than just a chain of command?
Well, I think this probably comes from my experiences growing up in small towns in the South. Everybody had guns. Everybody knew how to use guns. And it wasn't as though we were preparing for some sort of apocalypse or something. We were just out shooting squirrels and messing around with shotguns. We were not drilling and preparing to invade Georgia or whatever, from Tennessee. The culture was one of mutual respect and knowing that the guy on your left and your right knows how to use firearm, and that if God forbid, but if it comes to it, he will. And I think it starts from the most basic human principles of culture: love for one's family and one's hometown. People don't naturally hate one another. They have to be taught, and government is basically the art of teaching people how to hate one another. I think it's very rare to find people who really sincerely hate other people, other groups of people, without instruction from some sort of government. But the gun is there to keep my family safe from people who get big ideas in their heads about taking my money and my property. As long as I know that the other folks around me have those basic same ideas, that love for the place that we call home. And I know that down south, there are a lot of folks who have that basic love. And everywhere in the world, the samurai, the original samurai, they had it. When people from the government started poking around, they said, "Sorry, sir, we're just not going to give you our food. We're just not going to do it." It's a basic human instinct that you lose when you become a statist. You think that you can solve the world's problems with a white paper or with some sort of regulation about s'mores and fruit. I think that's what I mean by it's a culture more than a chain of command. Of course, you will have naturally people who are leaders. In any group, you're going to have people who are going to be the captains and people who are going to be the privates. And it's just, in the course of interaction that emerges. But what I want is a good, solid community of people who know how to use guns and don't really want to use them, but will if they're provoked. I think that's what makes a militia, in my opinion.
Can you imagine what this system would look like if adopted in other countries? For instance, would this militia type organization work in modern day Japan?
It's a great question. I've had this conversation with people. I've proposed this idea, that a Switzerland idea. I've spoken with people here about my Switzerland idea, that if you really want, because as you very well know, Japan is in the midst of, I think basically you by rights it ought to be called a war with the People's Republic of China for the past 130 something days, maybe almost 140 days. Every single day, the People's Liberation Army Navy, masquerading as the Chinese Coast Guard, has been in the waters around the Senkaku Islands, part of Ishigaki City in Okinawa. That's an invasion. It's an invasion. They're softening the resistance of the Japanese government to defend its own territory. In the light of that sort of thing and other provocations by the People's Republic of China, I thought it'd be great if Japan was like Switzerland, if they had a system where every able-bodied man had a gun, a rifle, and had some basic training in how to use it, how to load it, how to clean it, how to shoot it. I think that would be, in my opinion, that would secure these islands better than any other. I mean, of course, if you're going to fight People's Republic of China, you're going to need planes and tanks and bombs and that sort of thing. But if you really want to be free, I think that if everyone were to overturn Hideyoshi's edict of 1588 and go back to having weapons, that'd be great. And so many people I've talked to here said, I just don't think that would work with Japanese culture that's developed over the past 1,000 years of samurai rule. The peasants have basically gotten used to entrusting their safety to armed men. So maybe there's a point to that. I don't know if it would work here, to be honest with you. I really don't. Because people here are so, there's a very strong, almost emotional reaction to owning firearms here. So I'm not sure it would work.
Then again, we can also look at the rapidity, the quickness with which the Meiji government transformed those peasants into a national army during the imperial days. There were enough people that were willing to step up and fill the ranks and go on the offensive, indeed, to create this East Asian co-prosperity sphere that led to World War II. So I would imagine that there's something in the culture that would allow them to transform if there was the need and there was the accepted practice.
I've been thinking about this for a long time. I have complete respect for Japan, and especially for the warriors of Japan. This is the country of Miyamoto Musashi. This is the country of Utsunomiya Taro, country of Fukushima Yasumasa. I mean, these are people who were not only skilled warriors, but they were brilliant tacticians. They knew how to find out what they needed to know about their enemy so they could defeat him. Japan doesn't need any advice from anybody. They don't really need any help from anybody in defending their country. This country has more than proven its ability to fight. I would love to see Japan bring that spirit back, because the assault from the People's Republic of China is very real. And I love this country. I love Japan. I do not want to see this country become enslaved by the Chinese Communist Party, which is what has happened to Tibet and to East Turkestan and to part of Mongolia, Manchuria. North Korea is basically a slave of the Chinese Communist Party. I would love to see folks here remember the glories of their martial past. I mean, I know I called them statist nuisances. I'm sorry about that. I would like to see a little more samurai spirit and end this incursion by the Chinese government. I think it's gotten to the point where something's got to be done.
Well, we've covered a lot of territory. Is there anything else that you'd like to add to our discussion?
Well, there is one of the things that we brought up in our earlier back and forth was about the end of the American Empire. You asked whether it's going to come down with a shudder or if there's something more destructive. I think that a rearrangement of the political configuration of North America is long overdue. It's not working anymore. There are some states, there are some cities, actually, I guess you could say, some counties that subscribe to the Washington mentality. But look at the red county, blue county map, or don't even go to the red county, blue county. Just look at gun ownership. There are a lot of people in the United States that don't want to be told what to do by Washington, D.C. anymore. If there's a peaceful way to reconfigure the North American polity. We go back maybe to states or to coalitions of states or maybe coalitions of counties. I think it would be great to have the Indian reservations turned into nation states that don't have any association with the federal government. I think that there's a peaceful way to do this if we sit down and talk about it and decide who's going to get what and how this is going to work out. Because the alternative that I see is that what we saw last summer, 2020, spiraling into really bad nationwide violence. Once that gets out of hand, we're back to Minamoto no Yoritomo and clans of armed vigilantes basically trying to get what they can out of the chaos. So I'm hoping there's a peaceful solution to that.
That's right. And that's usually in the midst of chaos when a strong man has to emerge. And that's where totalitarianism has to then take its natural course.
Right. It just presents so many opportunities for the wrong kinds of people to come to power. Definitely.
That's like what Hayek talked about, why the worst get on top. And what we're looking for is the Hayekian sense of spontaneous order.
Right, exactly. Spontaneous order. I think that's the key. And Rothbard was great about this, about the so-called elite of society and how they get to be the so-called elite and how the worst people always end up in the biggest chairs. I think he was so right about that. So yeah, I guess the final word would be a shout out to Rothbard and Hayek about their theory of the state.
With a good dose of Hans Hermann Hoppe tossed into the mix as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So where can people follow you or learn more about what you're working on?
I have a little website that I'm happy to share the link to, and I occasionally write for the Mises Institute, the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, the book review editor there, Mark Thornton. He's fantastic, a friend of mine, and he occasionally lets me run some longer book reviews. I sometimes write for the New Oxford Review, the Remnant, the Imaginative Conservative, a whole bunch of different outlets. I'm thrilled if anybody reads anything I write. Usually it's, my wife and my mom, basically the only ones. So if folks read what I write and they get in touch with me, I'm thrilled.
Well, we'll be looking out for your next piece and certainly look forward to having you back on Everyday Samurai again. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Friends, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of Everyday Samurai and look forward to seeing you next time. The show notes for today's episode, including a link to the article we discussed and a link to Professor Morgan's website, are available at everydaysamurai.life/49. If you like what you've heard here, be sure to give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or the podcatcher of your choosing. Be sure to like and share the show to help build that community of enlightened warriors in service to liberty. As a reminder, the free resources in our resource library are available at everydaysamurai.life/library. And you can up-level your cognitive and cellular regeneration functions with the good products at Neurohacker Collective. Take 15% off your first order with the code EDSAMURAI at everydaysamurai.life/neuro. That's everydaysamurai.life/neuro. Until next time, stay sharp, stay aware, and be well.